He thought I would remain silent, that I would stay in my role, the loving wife who stands in the shadows, greeting guests with a smile on her face while he walks around with her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever acquired. He has brought her here. To this ball that I had put so much effort into, that was my work and my time, and it was here that he showed her to everyone. The woman he called his companion clung to him like a trophy, and I was powerless to agree. When I walked in, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I lingered, entering later than everyone else, but not alone. My gaze met his for a moment. It was enough for him to understand. I didn't come for nothing. I didn't come to talk. I had come to shatter his world. He stood by the stage, surrounded by guests, listening to the applause and admiration, watching his project, his name, his successes being embraced. He was the center of this world, and I was just his shadow. He never talked about my projects, how I built his business, what I put into our business together. I was just his wife, an ornament that completes the picture but doesn't deserve recognition. He never noticed how much effort I put in, but that changed today. I wasn't just a wife. I was the person who could destroy him if I wanted to, and I started to do it. He didn't know it was the beginning of the end. I didn't yell. I didn't throw insults. I just came with him, with the man he hated the most, with this man he considered a threat, who was not only his rival in business, but in life. I walked in with Leonard Gray, my longtime ally and strategic partner, and it was more than just an appearance. It was a statement. He saw us, and his face went pale for a moment. He froze, his eyes darting around, trying to comprehend what had happened. It was the moment his world began to crack at the seams. His mistress, his pride and reward, stood by his side, and he didn't know what to do. He was stunned. He didn't expect me to do this, didn't think I'd risk destroying his facade. And here I was, standing next to the person he hated, just smiling as if nothing had happened. I walked past them without a glance in their direction and felt everyone's attention focused on us. And when I passed him, I didn't say a word. He turned his head to say something. I knew it from the look on his face. But I just turned to Leonard, whispered something that made him laugh. The whole room heard that laugh, and his face paled even more. I didn't try to find his gaze. I didn't need to do that. All I did was show that I was no longer the one standing in the shadows. I was where I belonged now, and all he could do was watch his world crumble. The fate of that night was sealed. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't destroy it in front of everyone. No, I saved all of that for when he wasn't ready for it. He didn't realize that I had already started my game. I left that night not only with memories, but with a plan. A clear plan that at that moment was just beginning to take shape. I went back to our apartment, to the place that had once been our home. We hadn't lived as a real family for a long time, but we still retained the legal ties. It was the last thing that held us together. I went into the bedroom, walked to the safe, and started going through the papers. I hadn't touched them in months, but now I needed everything I'd once signed. All those contracts, agreements, shares in businesses that remained in our joint ownership. I laid them out in front of me, one by one, and began to formulate a plan. Max thought I didn't notice how manipulative he was being, but I always knew I couldn't be carefree with him, and he made the mistake of asking me to co-found Creston Designs 3 years ago. It was a gift for supporting him through a difficult time when his name wasn't yet so well known. He didn't know that I had quietly and secretly made copies of all the documents I had signed, and he also didn't know that I had been recording our conversations. It had become a habit after all the years of working with people who could lie like breathing, and now those tapes are my weapon of choice, especially the one where he admitted to inflating estimates and bribing officials to get building permits. He was drunk, which was no surprise, but now those words said in jest became my valuable evidence. I took the first step. Shortly after I got home, I made an appointment with Leonard Gray, my business partner and longtime friend. He was my ally, not just in business, but in life. We needed to discuss the details of the next move, and I knew he would agree. "We'll take our time," I said. "Let Max think he's in control. He'll soon realize that things have changed." He nodded, and we began to discuss exactly how and when we would strike. Everything had to be perfect. A few days passed, and I started working with Leonard in secret. We created a new project, a new company that I named Veritas Interiors. It was important. Everything Max had once thought was his was going to be taken over. He didn't know that. He didn't know that my company's name would soon be on the front pages of every design magazine, and his name would be forgotten, like so many other things he once thought were immutable. But it all started with small steps. We were soon to host an important event, a charity gala dinner attended by all the important people from the real estate and investment world. I knew Max would be there. He couldn't afford not to be. And at that moment, I was going to take the stage, not as his wife, but as the woman he was trying to erase from his life. But I was ready to reclaim everything he was trying to take away. When I walked into the auditorium in a bright red dress, not to hide, but instead to make myself known, everything around me fell silent. All eyes were on me. Leonard was by my side, and we moved the way I'd always wanted us to, confidently and proudly. Max was standing by the champagne fountain, his eyes already starting to search for me. When I saw the look in his eyes, I didn't need to say anything. His face turned pale, and I felt something inside me flare up. This was more than a rematch. This was justice being served. Max and his mistress froze as I walked past, but I didn't even glance in their direction. I wasn't going to satisfy his desire to see me humiliated. He thought I was going to break down, but I stood as if I were the personification of strength, and I knew I would never be in the shadows again. I stared at him as I walked past him. He was no longer a man who could threaten me. In that moment, I realized that his downfall was just the beginning. He thought he was in control of everything, but in reality, the whole time I had been behind the scenes, building my own game. The evening wasn't the end for me, but it was for Max. That night, when he was alone in his world, I had already started to move forward. I went back to the same house we once called our own and opened the safe again. I had no doubt that everything would be exactly as I had planned. Everything was going to be under my control. Now, a few days later, I began to actively work on my plan. I reread the documents, remembering every detail, every moment that could be used against him. Above all, I was the co-founder of Creston Designs, and he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated me. It was because of my role in the company that I was privy to all the operations, all the machinations, all the little secrets that ultimately led to the fact that I could turn his empire to dust. I knew that if I acted quickly and accurately, Max wouldn't realize what was happening until it was too late. But to do that, I needed more than just information. I had to get him to set himself up. All those recorded conversations, those estimate papers, those letters instructing me to bribe officials. They had to be my trump cards. I could have been cruel. I could have brought him out right away. But it was more important to me to see him bring his world down on his own, not realizing what was happening. With each passing day, I could feel his world starting to crack. Max was trying to control the situation, calling his lawyers, trying to get even. But I was in no hurry. I waited for the right moment, and it came when I finally met with Leonard Gray to discuss our next steps. "We'll wait a little longer," he said, sitting across the table from me in the office I'd just opened under the new brand. This would be the final chord. I nodded, agreeing. We were ready for the next step. But even more important was that now I could no longer stay in the shadows. Everything that was hidden had to become public. As we prepared for our next big event, a high-profile charity gala dinner, Max and his mistress, Caitlin, were in the foreground, confident in their immunity. But I knew this night would be mine. I came with Leonard, and our footsteps caught everyone's attention. People looked around, smiling, but there was a fire burning inside me. I wasn't just back. I was the center of attention again, and this time it wasn't because I was just someone's wife. I was a woman who hadn't just been quiet, but was now openly asserting herself. Max stood at the champagne counter next to Caitlin, his pride and new jewelry. But it was all an illusion, and I was ready to shatter it. I walked into the hall with a confident gait, wearing the very dress that made it impossible to go unnoticed. I was ready for this meeting, and I didn't need to say a word to make them realize I wasn't here to be in the shadows. I walked past them, and Max froze. He couldn't believe his eyes. This was the moment his world changed forever. He handed a glass of champagne to Caitlin, but I noticed his hand trembling. I walked by and smiled without saying a word, then whispered something to Leonard. His laughter, loud and ringing, sounded so loud it echoed in the silence. Max went pale, his face contorted in surprise. I paid no attention to them, just continued on my way, confident in my step. This night was mine, and all Max could do was watch his world crumble around him. In that moment, I realized I didn't need to make a loud statement. My gaze and my silence spoke far more than any words could. It had been weeks since the night I'd walked into the gym with Leonard and left Max with his mistress, shaken and helpless. Things had started to change just as I'd expected them to. He tried to hold on, tried to control the situation, but it was too late. I wasn't going to be rushed. My silence was a weapon, and it was working perfectly. During those weeks, I continued to work on my project. Or rather, not just a project, I was building my empire. Veritas Interiors became more than just a firm. It was my answer to everything I once hid in the shadows. I was creating a space where I could be myself. Every detail, every decision was mine. And slowly, I began to gain the respect and attention of those who once looked at me as an add-on to Max's success. But I never forgot the goal. Every action was part of a strategy. I knew what had to happen for everything to fall apart at Max's place. Everything was in his hands, and I was ready to watch him dig his own grave. My role was to help him do it, but the first thing I needed to do was to consolidate my position in the market. I wrote down a new company name, signed contracts with my most important clients. I started reaching out to new partners, and they began to realize that I wasn't just a wife forgotten in the shadows. I was a force. And that was before I gave Max that final blow. The plan was simple. I had to wait for the right moment. And when Max was announced for another night as a presenter at an important event in the investment world, I knew this was my chance. It was a moment where I could come out and say, I'm here, and this is my world now. The event was held downtown. All the major players were there. Max, his mistress, and a bunch of investors I had once worked side by side with to help build his empire. Now they were leaning more and more in my direction. I watched from the sidelines, not getting involved. But when my moment came, I walked into the hall with Leonard, and just like before, no one expected this turn. Max was still confident that he was in control of the game. He stood next to Caitlin, confident that this time he was in control. But I wasn't the kind of woman who would stand silently in the corner while his eyes sparkled with pride at someone else's victory. My gaze met his. It was simple, but in that silence between us, it was all I needed to know. I was ready for the next step. With each step, each look, each whisper in Leonard's ear as he laughed, my steps grew more confident. This night was not for Max. He'd already lost everything he thought he had. I walked past him, ignoring him like he was an empty space that no longer mattered. And this wasn't revenge. It was justice being served. It was my path to freedom. Then came what I had been waiting for. The news of his corruption schemes soon came to light. At that moment, I knew he couldn't take a step back. He was already trapped in a trap from which there was no way out. And I smiled because I realized that everything was now in my hands. As the weeks passed, I could already feel his world crumbling. Max tried to fight. He used all his connections, tried to block the leaks. But I knew all. His efforts were in vain. People were starting to drift away from him. He was no longer the successful and all-powerful man that everyone wanted to do business with. Every move he made was a mistake, and I watched it as if from a spectator's seat. One by one, his projects were threatening to fail, and investors were starting to pull their money. But Max hadn't yet realized that his downfall was only a matter of time. That's when I decided to make my next move. I set up a meeting with several major players, including some high-profile journalists I trusted. We needed to develop the story I had prepared. A story about how his corruption schemes had started to fall apart, about how his own staff had started to go silent. When I started passing on information and providing evidence of his crimes, I knew it would be the beginning of the end. The media, who had picked up on my information, began to spin the scandal, and I watched all his power drain away from him. But despite all these moves, I realized that what mattered most to me wasn't what was going to happen to him now. No, that wasn't my ultimate goal. I wanted him to realize for himself that everything he'd built had been destroyed precisely because of his recklessness. I was waiting for the moment when he would realize he couldn't control the situation anymore, but I wouldn't stop. I wasn't going to sit back and let him walk away with minimal consequences. I was doing everything I could to reclaim everything he had once taken. My success was now my weapon, and his downfall was the result of his own decisions. Once all of this information became public, I knew the moment of the final blow had arrived. That evening, Max was back at an important event. He was the host, sitting at the microphone with his lips pressed, together as if he didn't care about anything. But I knew that inside he already realized that everything he had created was about to crumble. The people who had once supported him were now turning and looking in my direction. All I had to do was show up and let them know who was really running this game. And I did. I didn't just show up. I came with the intention of making sure everyone saw me. I walked into the auditorium with such confidence that every eye was on me. With Leonard by my side, as always, I walked past Max. We moved confidently, as if this was our event. I smiled without saying a word, and in that moment, everything in his eyes changed. Max was still trying to hold himself up, but his face went pale when he saw me beside him, like I was a queen, the epitome of strength and determination. I wasn't going to humiliate him. No, I was beyond that. My silence spoke for me. My presence in that room was the loudest statement I could make. He realized he couldn't go back to his game. It was all in my hands now, and I savored this moment. I was in no hurry. He was already going down on his own. After the evening of the charity gala dinner was the very moment Max realized his world had changed. I couldn't stop. I became determined to move forward, and everything I did was now a step toward the victory he had overlooked for so long. He was trying to focus on his work, dragging all of his cases out again, trying to deal with the aftermath of the scandal, but it was no use anymore. Everything Max had once built was falling apart, and now his only job was to at least try to save his reputation. But it wasn't there. He didn't realize that his downfall was inevitable. His attempts to save his empire were empty, and when I saw him desperately trying to control the situation, I knew the moment had come to end it all. Over the next few weeks, I continued to prepare the ground. I met with people, passed on information that confirmed his crimes, and my resolve only grew stronger. This wasn't just revenge. This was about getting justice. I wasn't going to hide in the shadows anymore. Everything I did was out in the open now, and I didn't have to prove anything. Those who had been close to Max were starting to turn down his offers. The people I had worked with before were now on my side. I kept getting news of how his stock was falling, how his projects were losing value. No one believed in his promises anymore, but I was calm. I didn't rush into a decision. I waited. And when finally an article appeared in a major business publication about his corruption schemes, I knew it was over. It was the final blow, and now nothing could stop his downfall. Maxie tried to find ways to exonerate himself and even reached out to his lawyers. But the moment his legal team was powerless, I knew victory was mine. Leonard and I were already planning our next move at this point, and all I had to do was wait for this game to be over. At one of the evening meetings organized to celebrate a major new deal, Max was sitting at the bar, his gaze blank, and he seemed to have lost his power. Everything around him seemed familiar, but I knew he was on edge. And then I decided to show up for everyone to see. I walked into the meeting like a winner again, but not with pride, but with confidence. Leonard walked beside me, and we were both ready to see his empire crumble in front of everyone. When I entered the hall, all eyes were on me again. Leonard and I walked confidently, with smiles, as if the whole evening was ours. In that moment, I felt like the Max I once. Love no longer had power over my world. He tried to look strong, but I knew it was all just a mask. He was no longer able to come back. Max spotted me in the crowd, and his face went pale. His fingers clenched on the glass, but he still couldn't utter a word. I walked past him without stopping, not paying the slightest attention to him. I smiled at Leonard, and we kept moving. The whole room was watching us, and Max could do nothing but watch his world fall apart. I knew now that everything I did was now part of a game that I had won. It was more than revenge. It was restoring justice. And in that moment, as I felt everything take its course, I realized his empire no longer existed. Everything that was happening was more like small touches than a final consummation. Every move, every step, every decision I made was part of the big picture I was building. I knew that Max had once thought he was in control of everything that was his. But now that his world was crumbling, I no longer saw him as the man I once loved. With each passing day, his reputation continued to lose its strength. But despite this, he was still trying to fight. He called out to his partners, tried to cover his tracks, but I knew it was too late. He was wrong to leave me in the shadows. He didn't realize that this very shadow had once been his foundation. I kept moving forward. My name was becoming more and more famous, and in business circles, everyone started discussing me, not Max. I saw him trying to manage the situation, but it was too late. His projects were losing profits, and his partners started to avoid him. They knew that I had become the right person to work with now. Just when I thought his downfall was complete, a new development came. Leonard offered to negotiate with those involved with Max, but I took my time. My silence was my last and strongest weapon. I waited until the moment when his own mistakes became so obvious that no one could ignore them. When his secrets became known, I felt that justice had been served. At that point, it was obvious that Max could no longer restore his reputation. All his wealth, everything he'd built, was on the verge of destruction. But more importantly, he couldn't get back what I had taken from him. I was at the height of my power, and I savored this moment because I knew that the moment had come when everything in my life fell into place. Max was increasingly out of control. He sought help from his lawyers and acquaintances, but no one could help him. His reputation was already irretrievably damaged. Investors began to withdraw from his projects, and news of his machinations with money began to spread like wildfire. When it became clear that he would not be able to hide the truth, I realized that the time for the final blow had come. I, for my part, continued to build my career. My business was growing, and my decisions were becoming more and more certain. I wasn't in a rush. I knew things would happen the way I wanted them to. Everyone looked up to me, and everything I did carried weight. And if Max was still trying to wrest something from me, It didn't matter anymore. His attempts seemed pathetic. When the moment came, when all my strategic moves were complete and I knew the climax was coming, I called Leonard. We agreed to meet and discuss the final actions. "We won," he said as I sat down across from him. "You won. Everything we've built is now yours." I nodded and smiled, not because I was proud, but because I knew it was deserved. Max, who once thought he could control me, couldn't do anything anymore. Everything was on my terms. When it became finally clear that everything around Max was crumbling, I took my time. He was still trying to keep a straight face, but I knew it was just an echo of his former greatness. Every day he spent trying to rebuild his reputation was more and more agonizing for him. He couldn't realize what had been lost forever. His world was no longer the same. But I was calm. I knew that all his efforts were futile. While his company was losing value, I was becoming more successful every day. I was creating a business that was no longer just my personal project. It was a sign that I was no longer dependent on what he had once created. Everything he had tried to build was on the rubble of his own lies. And then came the moment when I could finally celebrate my victory. I had arranged for Leonard to meet with several important people who could play a crucial role in the future of his business. We were going to discuss how to finalize his latest projects and fully reallocate the assets he had for so long considered his own. When it came time for the final blow, I didn't want to rush into it. I wanted him to realize for himself that everything he once had was now completely destroyed. That evening was the culmination of my long journey. It was a moment when I didn't have to explain anything. His fall was not just a matter of timing. It was a matter of my patience and willingness to play by my own rules. No one else could support him. His partners and even former employees began to disown him. His name was at the center of a scandal, and his entire empire that he had so proudly built was beginning to crumble. That evening, when everything finally came to a conclusion, I watched Max sitting in yet another important meeting. He tried to look confident, but his eyes were filled with worry. He knew that his every move would now be monitored. Every choice he made would be interpreted as a last-ditch attempt to escape the cracks I had spent so long preparing. Leonard and I sat down in the same room where he had once stood on a pedestal. But it was different now. Everything I had created had become more valuable than anything he had ever done. When I walked into the hall with Leonard, everyone's attention was on us. We weren't just sitting next to each other. We were a team ready to take what he so confidently thought was his. Max noticed us. His eyes immediately narrowed. I could feel his face go pale, his body tense. It was the moment he realized that was it. He had lost. No one paid attention to his attempts to justify himself. Everything that was happening around him was a game in which he was no longer a player. I knew that now I could safely step back and leave him behind. His business was ruined and his reputation destroyed. That night, I didn't feel bitterness. I didn't feel revenge. I felt freedom. I was no longer his wife, no longer in the shadows. I was a woman who had created her own success and now owned everything that had once belonged to him. When the evening was over and everyone had dispersed, I stayed in the empty hall, standing at the window, watching the lights of the city fade into the night. I knew that now was the moment of final victory. Max was broken. His empire was disappearing before his eyes, and there was nothing more he could do to take back everything that had once been his. He was a stranger to me, and I felt no regret or pity. All I felt was nothing but release. I had no doubt that everything was fair. Max had always believed that the world around him would spin as it suited him. He'd done this not only to me, but to people who had once believed in him, but were now beginning to realize who he really was. He was a victim of his own arrogance, and that was his punishment. I thought about how his downfall was inevitable, and I was proud that I was able to do it without screaming, without tantrums, without unnecessary words. Everything had been resolved quietly, step by step, with patience, which had finally paid off. Now I began to plan the next step. I spent the next week meeting with potential partners to expand my business. Each day brought new opportunities. Veritas Interiors continued to grow. I was at the peak of my career, and this was just the beginning. Max could no longer offer me anything. He couldn't give me back what I had: freedom, success, and confidence. His business was on the verge of collapse, and it wasn't just a loss of profits. It was the loss of everything he once thought he owned. When his company finally collapsed, I knew there would be nothing to lift him up. He was left with empty hands and a ruined reputation. But I didn't need to feel sorry for him. He had chosen this path for himself. As the weeks passed, I watched everything Max once thought he owned go. His companies were filing for bankruptcy. He tried to leave behind even crumbs of his former greatness, but nothing worked. He turned to his lawyers, but they could no longer help. Time was up. I didn't know where he was, and I wasn't interested. He remained just a part of my past. I continued to build my career. Veritas Interiors signed some big contracts, and I began to expand my business into new cities. One day, while sitting in my new office, I received an email from his assistant. At first, I didn't want to open it, but something inside me made me do it. It wasn't to get something out of the situation. No, it was to realize that he had already lost everything. And with each step, he was becoming more insignificant. The letter said that he could no longer keep afloat. His accounts were frozen, and he himself was barely making ends meet. I put the letter aside and turned back to my desk. I didn't feel victory. I felt peace. Everything I had built was now standing on its own 2 feet. His calls and letters became less and less frequent. He probably thought I would react, that I would come back into his life. But I was no longer the kind of woman who forgave, especially for such a betrayal. He had lost not only me, but his only chance to get it all back. Weeks passed, and I felt the air grow lighter. Everything that had once seemed important was now empty and insignificant. I learned to breathe again. I learned to look at the world in a new way, without looking back at the man who had once been my husband. There was nothing left in him to cling to. He was weak, and that caused me no pain or regret. I continued to build my business. I met new partners, signed contracts, and began expanding Veritas Interiors into other regions. I was proud that I was able to create something of my own. It was my work, my credit, and now the world was finally realizing that I didn't have just a name behind me, but real power and perspective. Max disappeared from my life. He was no longer trying to find me, no longer trying to bring me back to his world. He had probably already realized his chance was gone. His calls never came in again. His letters went unanswered. I didn't respond to his inquiries. I wasn't the woman who waited for him to return. I was the woman who went forward. From time to time, I heard of his failures. His whole business was slowly but surely crumbling, and I felt empowered by it. I didn't even feel satisfied. I wasn't concerned about his downfall. It was all just a consequence of his own hubris. He had chosen this path on his own. I started leading new projects, launching even more ambitious ideas that I couldn't even imagine before. There were no limits anymore. I was in my place. No past resentments could hold me back. Finally, the day came when I decided to take my final step. I applied for a major project that was considered the most important in the architecture industry. This was the chance I had been waiting for, not to seek revenge, but to finally secure my position. When the results of the competition were announced and my name came in first place, I felt the world I was building become even more solid. I hadn't just won this project, I had won my life. It was my victory, a victory of my strength and determination. It was a victory that Max could never have imagined. As I stood on stage receiving my award, I knew that I would now be impossible to outshine. I was no longer someone's shadow. I was an independent woman who could create not just projects, but a future. In my hands now were not just construction blueprints, but my own path. And in that path, there was no room for those who had once considered me weak or inconspicuous. Max was gone from my life completely. I no longer worried about him, no longer thought about his problems. He had become a part of the past for me, and I was neither sorry nor sad. He was no longer in my reality. When I first looked at the huge skyscraper that I myself had designed and supervised its construction, I realized all I had achieved was not revenge. It was about restoring justice, restoring myself. I was a woman who had come from the shadows and now stood at the center, ruling my own world. Life went on, and I felt more and more like I was breathing freely. I stopped thinking about the past, about what held me back. What held me back? I was my own possession now. I didn't need anyone to define me. I didn't need anyone to take my time and strength. I was creating everything on my own, and it felt wonderful. I knew that my name had become synonymous with success in the architectural community. Everyone now knew who I was. My name had become a brand. Veritas Interiors didn't just grow, it became a symbol that women could not only be supportive, but build on par with men. Everything I have achieved has been the result of my own efforts, my own decisions. I started new projects, and each of them became successful. I never looked back. I didn't think about Max, didn't think about his downfall. He was no longer in my reality. I was only focused on myself, on what I was building and creating. And now that I was standing on top, I couldn't help but think about how it had all started. How one moment, one night when I made the decision to not stay in the shadows, led me to where I was today. Sometimes I would meet people who would say that I had become an inspiration. I didn't have to explain to anyone that I wasn't doing it for anyone. I was doing it for me. I was the architect of my future, and no one but me could influence where I was going. There was no room for regret along the way. I didn't live for revenge. Revenge was not my goal. I was a living, free woman who refused to be a shadow. I often received letters and messages thanking me for being an example to other women, for being able to step out of the shadows and assert myself. But for me, it wasn't about being an example. It was about taking my life back. I had freed myself from everything that had once been my obligation. I wasn't someone's wife. I wasn't someone's shadow. I was me. My name wasn't just something that was associated with some company. It became a symbol of change. And when I signed another contract or completed a new project, I realized that I had created more than just a business. I had created a life where there was no room for betrayal or fear. Max kept disappearing from my mind like a ghost. He tried to come back, tried to find a way to rebuild his career, but it was all empty. I was no longer interested in his problems. His disappearance from my life was the best proof that I had made the right choice. The day I walked into the gym with Leonard, I hadn't just made a statement. I had built a new life, and nothing could stop me now. I felt that over the years of fighting him, I hadn't just defeated him. I had defeated my addiction to his world. I had broken free from that cycle, and now I was in my own reality. It was a release that needed no words. A few months passed, and life continued to flow. I stood at the top where Max had once seen only himself. He never came back, and he might never come back. But I felt no bitterness, no regret, no satisfaction. I felt only peace. He disappeared from my world as quickly as he appeared in it. I was becoming more and more the person I had once dreamed of, a strong, independent woman, able to make her own destiny. And I didn't need any approval for that. I was creating, building, inspiring others, and I was proud of it. I wasn't looking for revenge. Revenge had already been won back, not in a storm of emotions, but in how I was able to rebuild my life and turn it into something I could look back on with pride. I signed a contract with an international company that launched a new project in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. My name is now synonymous with quality, not just a last name that was once in the background. The magazine that had just published an article about the new horizons of my business said, "The woman who raised skyscrapers and broke stereotypes." And it was accurate. I didn't just go up, I broke down the barriers that once limited me. Every project was now more than just construction. It was my manifesto, my statement to the world that I was here, and I was creating my own reality. And as I stood at the top of one of my buildings, looking out over the city in which I had once been but a shadow, I knew I had done it. Max was gone. His name was just a reminder not to let anyone define your worth. He was left behind in his own broken world. But I felt no anger towards him. I felt nothing for him. He was part of a past that was long gone. And here I stood on the edge of a new world, a new phase. My name had come to symbolize not only success, but that I had traveled a path that many would not have traveled. But I didn't feel like a winner. No, I felt alive. I felt free of everything that had once dragged me down, free from the role that had once been thrust upon me, free from the shadows. In this city that I was now not just building, but shaping with my vision, I felt unity with every project. Every building, every sketch, every line on the blueprint was a reflection of who I had become. I was no longer someone's wife. I was no longer just part of someone else's success. I was me, and that was enough. Everything I had built now stood firm. And as I looked back on the path I had traveled, I realized not every day you have to fight to win. Sometimes victory comes when you just stop being afraid and start living the life you deserve. Here in this new world, I wasn't just a woman, I was the architect of my life. And this life was my greatest achievement. No shadow could overshadow me because I was the light that chose my own path.